The SEAL Admiral asked the black janitor what his code name was, as a joke, until Lone Eagle made him freeze. "So warrior, what's your military code name?" Admiral Grant Marshall's voice echoed through the Coronado Naval Base cafeteria, laden with venomous sarcasm as he pointed at the man in janitor's uniform cleaning the nearby tables. James Washington, 45, stopped wiping and calmly looked up. The entire cafeteria turned to watch the scene. Officers stopped eating. Soldiers suspended their conversations, all waiting for the show of humiliation that Marshall was clearly orchestrating. "Let me guess," Marshall continued, smiling at his captive audience. "Corporal Broom? Sergeant Mop?" The laughter started low, then spread through the room like a cruel wave of complicity. James had never imagined that 2 years of cleaning the same hallways he once walked with authority would end in a moment like this. After losing his wife in an accident and having to care for his 12-year-old daughter alone, he had accepted the only job available on base, even though he knew it would mean becoming invisible to men who had once saluted him. Marshall leaned in closer, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "Come on, buddy. You never really served? You're only here because you needed an easy job." The Admiral adjusted the medals on his chest, each one reflecting the fluorescent lights like little trophies of superiority. In recent months, James had noticed the condescending looks, the whispered comments, the way some younger officers made a point of dropping crumbs on the floor as he walked by. He had chosen to ignore it all. But something about Marshall's arrogance, the way he turned humiliation into public spectacle, touched a wound that had never completely healed. "My code name," James said quietly, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade, was Lone Eagle. The silence that followed was deafening. Forks stopped in midair. Conversations died instantly. A young soldier at the third table let out a muffled gasp. He had heard the legends whispered in training about a phantom operator who carried out impossible rescue missions. The smile froze on Marshall's face. His eyes flicked rapidly, as if trying to process information that didn't make sense. Because Lone Eagle wasn't just a code name, he was a myth. A legend that circulated among classified operations about a man who went alone into enemy territory and returned with hostages everyone thought were lost. James kept his gaze fixed on the Admiral, waiting for his reaction. For 2 years he had carried the humiliation silently, protecting his simple new life and his daughter from the storm that his true identity could cause. But at that moment, seeing the contempt turn to confusion in Marshall's eyes, he knew that the game had changed completely. There, before all the eyes that seconds before had despised him, James stood firm, like someone guarding a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. If this story of prejudice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple moment of humiliation would become the catalyst for a revolution that no one would ever forget. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Marshall to regain his composure and turn the confusion into something much more dangerous: utter contempt. Lone Eagle. Marshall let out a forced laugh, looking around to make sure everyone was paying attention. "Seriously? You think anyone here is going to believe this nonsense?" His voice rose, laden with an arrogance so toxic it practically poisoned the air. "A janitor pretending to be a military legend? What's next? Are you going to tell me you're related to the president himself?" James remained motionless, but something in his eyes changed, a coldness that made some of the more experienced soldiers shift uncomfortably in their chairs. They recognized that look. It was the same one they wore after missions they would rather forget. "Look at you," Marshall continued, circling James like a predator toying with its prey. Worn-out uniform, scuffed shoes, hands calloused from scrubbing floors. "Lone Eagle," he made a point of dragging out each syllable with scorn. "The only place you fly is on top of a broomstick." The laughter returned, louder now, fueled by their superiors' approval. James knew that each laugh was another brick in the wall of humiliation Marshall was building. But what the Admiral didn't know was that each insult was also being carefully filed away in the memory of a man who had spent 15 years learning how to turn information into lethal weapons. 3 weeks earlier, James had begun to notice a disturbing pattern. Marshall didn't humiliate him just for pleasure. There was method to the cruelty. The Admiral systematically destroyed the dignity of anyone he considered inferior in the base hierarchy. James had watched silently as Marshall made racist comments disguised as jokes, harassed civilian employees, and abused his authority to intimidate younger soldiers. Last week, James had witnessed Marshall yelling at a young Hispanic soldier until she cried, accusing her of not belonging in the American elite force. 2 days ago, he had seen the Admiral force a black soldier to clean toilets as extra discipline for an alleged disrespect that never happened. Each incident was meticulously recorded in James' mind, like data from a reconnaissance mission. "You know what I think?" Marshall leaned closer, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper that everyone could still hear. "I think you made up this pathetic little story to impress your little girl. What will she think when she finds out that Daddy is just a failed liar?" Marshall's fatal mistake was mentioning his daughter. James had lost his wife Rebecca 2 years ago in a car accident. She was a nurse at the base hospital and was returning late from a shift when a drunk driver changed their lives forever. Since then, his daughter Zoe was literally all that remained of significance in his world. Every day, every sacrifice, every silent humiliation he endured was to protect her stability and happiness. Zoe was 12 years old and at the age where she was beginning to understand social subtleties. She had recently asked why some of her schoolmates mocked her father's job, why some parents avoided talking to him at school events. James always answered patiently, explaining that honest work deserved respect, regardless of the uniform. But he saw the confusion in her eyes, the way she began to shrink when someone asked about her father's profession. "My daughter," James said softly, his voice cutting through the noise of the cafeteria like a blade through silk, "knows exactly who I am." Marshall smiled triumphantly, misinterpreting the restrained response as an admission of defeat. "Of course she does. A janitor who makes up lies to feel important." What Marshall failed to notice was that others in the cafeteria were beginning to pay close attention. Commander Torres, a veteran of 3 deployments, watched James with a thoughtful expression. Sergeant Williams, a specialist in special operations, had stopped eating altogether and was studying every micro-expression on the janitor's face. Because there was something about James' posture, the way he breathed, the controlled manner in which his hands remained relaxed as he absorbed each insult, that did not fit the image of a defeated man. It was the calmness of someone who had faced infinitely worse situations and emerged victorious. Over the past 2 years, James had done much more than just clean floors. He had watched, listened, and learned. He knew exactly which officers were corrupt, which military contracts were rigged, which soldiers were being systematically mistreated. He had documented everything with the precision of an intelligence analyst, because that was exactly what he used to be, long before he became Lone Eagle. Marshall continued his attacks for another 10 minutes, each insult more elaborate than the last, each humiliation more public. He talked about how people like James should accept their place in society, how it was natural that some were born to lead and others to serve. His words were pure poison, distilled through years of privilege and unchallenged prejudice. But what truly impressed James was not Marshall's cruelty. He had faced real enemies on real battlefields. It was the man's utter stupidity. Marshall was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't see the obvious signs around him. Veteran soldiers frowning, officers whispering among themselves, even some of those who had initially laughed beginning to look uncomfortable with the intensity of the attack. When Marshall finally finished his show and walked away, still laughing and making comments to his sycophants, James simply went back to work. He picked up his rag, put away the cleaning cart, and left the cafeteria with the same quiet dignity as always. But this time, something had fundamentally changed. Marshall had crossed a line he should not have crossed. He had made the situation personal. And personal was exactly Lone Eagle's specialty. Each new humiliation only strengthened something within him that his oppressors could not see, a quiet determination fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose. What that privileged admiral didn't know was that every act of contempt was paving the way for his own downfall, and that the man he had just publicly humiliated had the resources, knowledge, and connections that would turn his life into a waking nightmare very soon. That evening, James sat at the kitchen table in his modest home, pretending to help Zoe with her math homework while his mind processed every word Marshall had said in the cafeteria. His daughter, focused on her algebra problems, didn't notice when he discreetly opened his old laptop and began typing. "Dad, are you paying attention?" Zoe looked up, frowning. "I've asked you 3 times about this equation." James blinked, returning to the present. "Sorry, honey. Show me again." But as he patiently explained how to solve for x, part of his mind continued to work on a much more complex problem: how to systematically expose a corrupt officer without compromising his own safety or that of his daughter. Because James Washington wasn't just a janitor. And he definitely wasn't just Lone Eagle. Before becoming a legend in special operations, James had been a military intelligence analyst for 8 years. His specialty was mapping corruption networks in occupied territories, identifying patterns of behavior, and building cases that resulted in spectacular downfalls of seemingly untouchable figures. It was this skill, as much as his combat expertise, that had made him so valuable on the most sensitive missions. During his 2 years working at the base, James had done much more than observe. He had systematically documented every abuse of power by Marshall, every discriminatory comment, every violation of protocol. He knew about the overpriced contracts that the Admiral approved in exchange for gifts from suppliers. He knew the names of the soldiers that Marshall had transferred to dangerous positions for personal reasons. He even had audio recordings of some of the Admiral's most explicitly racist rants, captured by chance while cleaning his office. But documenting wasn't enough. James needed something that would destroy Marshall so completely and publicly that the man could never recover. And for that, he needed help. The next morning, during his break, James walked to the base's communications center. There, as always, he found Sergeant Martinez organizing transmission reports. Carmen Martinez, 34, was one of the few people on the base who always greeted him with genuine respect. She had grown up in a family of immigrants and recognized the look of someone who faced prejudice on a daily basis. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," she said, smiling. "How's Zoe?" "Fine, thank you." "Carmen," James lowered his voice, "I need to talk to you about something important. Something confidential." The serious tone made Carmen immediately stop what she was doing. She had known him for 2 years and had never seen him ask for a favor or show urgency. Over the next 20 minutes, in an empty back room, James carefully revealed what he had observed about Marshall. He showed photos on his cell phone of documents he had discreetly photographed, played audio clips he had recorded, and detailed the systematic pattern of abuse and discrimination. Carmen listened in growing silence, her eyes widening with each new revelation. "My God, James. That's huge. But why are you telling me?" "Because you have access to the base's communication systems. And because Marshall made a fatal mistake yesterday." James explained his plan. It wasn't emotional revenge, it was surgical justice. Marshall had publicly humiliated James, but in the process he had exposed his own arrogance in front of dozens of witnesses. Now it was a matter of using that arrogance against him. "The Admiral has a weakness," James continued. "He can't resist an audience. The bigger the audience, the further he goes with his comments. And this afternoon he has that teleconference with the Pentagon about officer evaluations." Carmen nodded slowly. As a communications technician, she would be responsible for setting up and monitoring the transmission. If during that call he makes comments like he did yesterday, but this time with senior officers listening. James left the sentence hanging. "It would be the end of his career," Carmen finished. "But how can we be sure he'll expose himself like that?" James smiled for the first time in days. "Leave that to me." The rest of the morning was spent in meticulous preparation. James knew he would only have one chance. Using his cleaning credentials, he accessed Marshall's office during lunch and discreetly installed a small recording device that Carmen had borrowed from the security equipment arsenal. He positioned it so that it would perfectly capture any conversation in the office, but would be virtually impossible to detect. Meanwhile, Carmen checked and rechecked the transmission systems for the afternoon teleconference. There was a rarely used function that allowed automatic recording of all communications for national security purposes, a protocol she could activate without prior authorization in situations she deemed suspicious. At 2:30 p.m., as Marshall was preparing for the call with his superiors at the Pentagon, James appeared at the office door with his cleaning cart. "Excuse me, Admiral. May I do a quick clean before your meeting?" Marshall, adjusting his uniform and checking that his medals were perfectly aligned, waved impatiently. "Be quick. And try not to break anything with those huge hands." The comment was exactly what James expected. Marshall never missed an opportunity to belittle, especially when he was about to report to superiors. The adrenaline of the performance made him even more cruel than usual. As he cleaned, James watched Marshall review his notes for the call. The Admiral was particularly excited today, commenting on how finally some officers with questionable track records would be put in their place. "You know, Washington," Marshall said suddenly, as if a brilliant idea had occurred to him, "you gave me a good laugh yesterday with that Lone Eagle story. I'm going to tell the generals about it today. They'll love hearing about janitors who think they're war heroes." James kept his expression neutral as he wiped down the table. "As you wish, Admiral." Man, you really believe your own lies, don't you? Marshall laughed loudly. I bet you tell your little girl that Daddy is a secret super soldier. How pathetic. Every word was being picked up perfectly by the hidden device. But James needed more. He needed Marshall to expose himself completely during the teleconference itself. Admiral, James said calmly, may I ask a question? Marshall rolled his eyes. What is it now? Do you really believe that people like me should never have served in the military? The question took Marshall by surprise. Its respectful and seemingly naive tone sounded like genuine curiosity from someone who really wanted to understand his superior's opinion. Look, Washington, Marshall settled into his chair, clearly preparing for a dissertation. It's not personal. It's a matter of reality. Some people are born to lead, others to follow. Some to command, others to clean. It's the natural order of things. James nodded as if absorbing a valuable lesson. And you think that applies to all people of my background? Look, Marshall leaned forward, fully entering the role of mentor. Statistically speaking, you have certain limitations. Nothing against it, it's just genetics. That's why it's important for everyone to accept their place in society. You understood that, you became a janitor. Your daughter should probably consider more suitable careers as well. The comment about Zoe made James' jaw twitch imperceptibly, but his voice remained calm. I understand. Thank you for your wisdom, Admiral. At that moment, Marshall's phone rang. The conference call was about to begin. James gathered his materials and left the office, but not before seeing Marshall adjust his posture, check his medals one more time, and adopt the expression of authority he reserved for impressing superiors. The Admiral was perfectly prepared for the performance of his life. What Marshall didn't know was that his conversation with James had already been accidentally broadcast as an audio test for the conference, reaching the ears of at least 3 generals waiting on the line. And that Carmen Martinez was at that very moment activating recording protocols that would document every word he would say for the next 60 minutes. Walking down the hallway with his cart, James allowed himself an almost imperceptible smile. Marshall was so excited to have such a prestigious audience that he couldn't resist expanding on his educational comments about social hierarchies and racial limitations. In 15 years of special operations, James had learned that the best time to capture an enemy is not when they are defensive, but when they are too confident to realize they have already fallen into the trap. And Marshall, inflated by his own arrogance and certain that he was among like-minded people, was about to hang himself with his own words before an audience that could destroy his career with a single disciplinary recommendation. In that quiet hallway, as he pushed his cart toward his next target, James Washington was no longer just a humiliated janitor or even a former operator seeking personal revenge. He was a seasoned strategist setting in motion the final phase of an operation that Marshall would never see coming, because men like the Admiral can never imagine that their victims might be smarter, better prepared, and infinitely more dangerous than they appear. At 2:45 p.m., the conference call began exactly as Marshall had planned. 3 Pentagon generals appeared on the office screen, impeccable uniforms, serious expressions of those discussing the future of national defense. Admiral Marshall greeted General Thompson, a veteran of 4 deployments. Let's review the evaluations of problematic officers at your base. Marshall shifted in his chair, smiling with the confidence of someone about to impress his superiors. Of course, General. We have a few cases that require special attention. What Marshall didn't know was that Carmen Martinez had accidentally left the audio channel open 5 minutes before the official start, allowing her conversation with James to be partially transmitted. The generals had already heard comments about genetic limitations and places in society. Admiral, General Williams interrupted, his expression visibly tense. Before we begin, I need to clarify some comments that have come to our attention. Marshall blinked, confused. Comments, sir. About social hierarchies and limitations based on racial origin. The blood drained from Marshall's face. But it was too late to back down. His arrogance pushed him forward. Well, General, I believe in speaking the truth. Certain people simply don't have what it takes for elite military leadership. The silence on the screen was deafening. Elaborate, General Thompson said, his voice icy. And Marshall elaborated. For 15 devastating minutes, he systematically laid out his views on racial inadequacy, natural hierarchies, and how people like that janitor should accept their limitations. Every word was captured in high definition, automatically recorded by national security systems. During this time, James walked calmly through the hallways, not like a defeated janitor, but like a commander executing the final phase of an operation. He arrived at the communication center just as Carmen gave a discreet signal. Everything was being documented. At 3:03 p.m., James knocked on Marshall's office door. "Come in," shouted the Admiral, irritated by the interruption. James opened the door, but this time he wasn't pushing a cleaning cart. He was carrying a folder of documents and an expression that made Marshall choke on a prejudiced sentence. "Sorry to interrupt, Admiral," James said calmly, his voice now carrying an authority that instantly changed the air in the room. "But I need to clarify some incorrect information you're sharing with our superiors." The generals on the screen leaned forward, intrigued. Marshall stammered, "Washington, get out of here immediately. I'm in an official meeting." "I know exactly what kind of meeting it is," James replied, stepping closer to the camera. "Generals, my name is James Washington, former Special Forces Major, codename Lone Eagle. I served under General Thompson's direct command between 2015 and 2019. General Thompson sat up straight as if he had been electrocuted. "Jesus Christ. Lone Eagle? Operation Thunderstorm in Afghanistan?" "Yes, sir. Rescue of 17 hostages behind enemy lines." Marshall was turning purple. "That's impossible. He's a janitor. He's lying." James opened his briefcase and began displaying documents in front of the camera. Certificates of honor, photographs with generals, records of classified missions. "Admiral Marshall has spent the last 2 years publicly humiliating me for believing I was unfit for anything other than cleaning." The expression on the generals' faces changed from shock to cold fury. "There's more," James continued, his voice remaining controlled while Marshall panicked. "During this time, I have systematically documented Admiral Marshall's discriminatory behavior." He held up a small tape recorder. "I have 47 recordings of explicitly racist comments, including the conversation you just witnessed. I also have evidence of overpriced contracts, punitive transfers of soldiers based on prejudice, and systematic harassment of civilian employees." Marshall stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You can't believe him. He's making this up to get revenge." "If revenge were my goal," James said calmly, "I would have acted long ago. But when a senior officer abuses his position to systematically humiliate those under his command, it becomes a matter of national security." General Williams spoke up, "Admiral Marshall, consider yourself formally suspended while we investigate these allegations." "Lone Eagle, sorry Major Washington, send us all the evidence immediately. It's already being transmitted through the base's secure system, courtesy of Sergeant Martinez." Marshall staggered, finally realizing the magnitude of what had happened. In 20 minutes, he had lost his career, his reputation, and his future. You can't do this to me." "Actually," said General Thompson, "we just did." The screen went dark, ending the most dramatic teleconference in the history of Coronado Naval Base. James put away his documents and looked at Marshall, who was now sitting on the floor, devastated. "Admiral, you were right about one thing. Every person has their place in society. Yours was never in a leadership position." Walking toward the door, James paused and turned around one last time. "Oh, and about my daughter? She always knew exactly who I am. The difference is that she loves me for the man I chose to be after the war, not for the soldier I was during it." Justice had been served with surgical precision, but one question remained unanswered. How would an entire military base react when it discovered that the man they treated as invisible was actually one of the greatest living legends in the U.S. Army? 6 months later, James Washington walked the same corridors of the base, but this time wearing the uniform of Special Advisor to the Pentagon for elite operations. The position had been offered personally by General Thompson, who made a point of making the appointment public and ceremonious. "Dad." Zoe ran to meet him after school, now 13 years old and carrying a first-place medal in math. "I did it. And the teacher said that if I keep this up, I can get a scholarship to MIT. James smiled, hugging her proudly. In the last few months, since her true identity had become known, Zoe had blossomed. She no longer had to hide who her father was or feel ashamed of his work. On the contrary, she was constantly approached by classmates wanting to hear stories about her hero dad. "And guess what?" she continued excitedly. the school principal asked if you could give a lecture on leadership to the high school students. As they walked, James noticed the respectful greetings from everyone who passed by. Young soldiers saluted him with genuine admiration. Officers stopped conversations to wave. Even civilian employees treated him with a deference that contrasted sharply with the 2 years of invisibility he had experienced. Across the base, in a small apartment in the suburbs of San Diego, Grant Marshall finished packing his last belongings. The Pentagon investigation had resulted in dishonorable discharge, loss of military pension, and criminal charges of systematic discrimination. No security or military consulting firm would hire him. The recordings had circulated widely in the military community. "Is Dad okay?" Zoe asked, noticing her father's thoughtful silence. "I'm fine, sweetheart," James replied honestly. "You know, for years I thought strength meant silently enduring any humiliation. But I've learned something important. Sometimes, true courage is knowing when to speak up." Carmen Martinez, now promoted to Chief of Communications for her crucial role in exposing Marshall, approached with a smile. "James, 3 more speaking invitations have arrived. One is from the Naval Academy." "The Naval Academy," Zoe murmured, impressed. "Will you accept?" James looked at his daughter, then at the hallways where he had been systematically humiliated. "Yes. I'm going to tell a story about a man who discovered that being underestimated can be the greatest advantage possible." That evening, over dinner at home, Zoe asked a question that took James by surprise. "Dad, do you feel sorry for Admiral Marshall?" James paused, considering carefully. "I feel sorry for anyone who wastes their life trying to diminish others instead of building something meaningful. But choices have consequences, Zoe. He chose hatred. I chose patience. And did patience win? Patience revealed the truth. And the truth always wins." 2 weeks later, James stood on the podium at the Naval Academy in front of 300 cadets, telling his story. Not as revenge, but as a lesson in dignity, strategy, and the power of maintaining integrity even when the world seems to be conspiring against you. "The man who tried to humiliate me was right about one thing," James said, concluding his speech. "Every person has their place in society. But that place is not determined by the color of your skin, your background, or the job you do. It is determined by the character you choose to carry." The applause was deafening. Grant Marshall tried to destroy James Washington, but ended up destroying only himself. James learned that true revenge is not retaliating for the harm done to you, it is achieving the success your enemies could never imagine. Because sometimes, the greatest victory is not defeating those who underestimated you, but proving that your strength never depended on their approval to exist. If this story of overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that character always triumphs over prejudice.